Hello and welcome to Background Briefing, available 24/7 at backgroundbriefing.org. I'm Ian Masters, and today we'll look into a number of stories and issues in the news. We'll begin with Trump's demented rambling yesterday on the first anniversary of his second term, which was followed by his incoherent, slurred and embarrassing speech today at Davos before a deathly silent audience as he railed against windmills, repeated grievances about winning the 2020 election, and told the Europeans how terrible Europe is without offering evidence. Joining us to discuss why the press piled on about Biden's mental acuity but are silent in the face of Trump's obvious madness is David K. Johnston, the co-founder of DCReport.org, a professor at the Rochester Institute of Technology, and a Pulitzer Prize-winning investigative reporter and 13-year veteran of the New York Times. He is the best-selling author of The Making of Donald Trump, and his latest book is The Big Cheat: How Donald Trump Fleeced America and Enriched Himself and His Family. Then we'll examine the shocking fact that this country's closest friend and neighbor is now making precautionary military plans to defend itself against a U.S. invasion ordered by a dangerous American leader who has many times claimed Canada as his 51st state. Joining us is Christian Leuprecht, a distinguished professor in the Department of Political Science and Economics at the Royal Military College of Canada and director of the Institute of Intergovernmental Relations at the School of Public Policy at Queen's University. He's the editor-in-chief of the Canadian Military Journal, and his books include Security Cooperation Governance, the Canadian-United States Open Border Paradox, and most recently, Military Operations in Response to Domestic Operations and Global Pandemics, Implications for Civil-Military Relations. Then finally, we'll speak with Jonathan Taplin, an author and director emeritus of the USC Annenberg Innovation Lab, who has produced music and film for Bob Dylan and the band, George Harrison, Martin Scorsese, Wim Wenders, Gus Van Sant, and others. He was the founder of The Entertainer, the first streaming video-on-demand platform, and currently sits on the boards of the Authors Guild, Americana Music Association, and has produced 12 films, including Mean Streets, The Last Waltz, Under Fire, and To Die For. He's the author of Move Fast and Break Things: How Facebook, Google, and Amazon Have Cornered Culture and Undermined Democracy. And his latest book is The End of Reality: How 4 Billionaires Are Selling a Fantasy Future of the Metaverse, Mars, and Crypto. We will discuss his article at Rolling Stone, Can the Counterculture Rise Again? Artists have always led resistance in America until Trump and the technocracy took over. And before we begin at the start of this new year, which will culminate in the fateful midterm elections in November, polls already indicate MAGA Republicans will lose the House and possibly the Senate. But we're up against a Trump-Miller presidency already drunk with power, and they will do anything to stay in power, having already demonstrated their contempt for the United States Constitution with Trump's January 6, 2001 coup attempt. They see over half of the country as their enemy and have a private army of loyal thugs ready to round up critics of the regime they label as communist lunatics. As Trump cowers, the media and his cronies buy up the mainstream press, Background Briefing will continue to expose this malevolent regime's fascistic machinations, providing a daily insight into the news as a massive coalition of people power is mobilized to bring about an end to this nightmare and usher in a new era of reform not seen since Nixon departed the presidency in disgrace. To help save America's 250-year-old democracy, we need all hands on deck, and you can make a tax-deductible donation to help us do our part at backgroundbriefing.org/donate or at publictruthmedia.org. And thank you. And joining us now is David K. Johnston, the co-founder of DCReport.org and a professor at the Rochester Institute of Technology and a Pulitzer Prize-winning investigative reporter and 13-year veteran of the New York Times. He is the best-selling author of The Making of Donald Trump, and his latest book is The Big Cheat: How Donald Trump Fleeced America and Enriched Himself and His Family. Welcome to Background Briefing, David K. Johnston.
Well, thank you for having me again, Ian.
Well, thanks for joining us, David. And today is Taco Day, not at your local Mexican restaurant, but in Davos today. Trump, who, taco stands for Trump always chickens out, he completely reversed himself on the military invasion of Greenland and now has dropped the tariff threats because apparently Mark Rutte basically made a deal with him. He could have always made a deal with Denmark. It was never nobody. They were totally accommodating. So many analysts that I talked to thought that the whole thing was not about Greenland, but about destroying NATO in order to, please his best buddy Putin. But I don't know. What do you think?
Well, I think, Ian, there are several elements to this. First and foremost, don't forget, Donald has to keep us distracted from the 99% of the Epstein files that have not been released, especially now that we have in the public record sworn testimony and, in another case, a journalist interview with a named person describing not only Donald Trump raping children, but there being still and video images of this, which would really devastate any case he has if that was to come out. So one element is you got to keep us distracted. Secondly, there's no line in Donald's mind between yours and mine. Whatever you have is only yours because Donald hasn't gotten it yet from you. And so when someone puts in his head the idea that we should have Greenland, namely one of his billionaire buddies who'd like to run mining operations there, never mind that that's going to be decades off in the future and we will all be gone, he gets fixated on these things. And then third, in addition to destroying NATO, which I think you're absolutely right about, there's an underlying falsity that it is shocking that none of the journalists I see covering this, other than myself, and none of the governments seem to recognize. And that's currently Greenland is protected by NATO. It's part of the Kingdom of Denmark, and therefore every one of the 31 NATO members is obligated to defend Greenland were Putin or Xi to move on it, as Trump claims they're going to do at some point. What would make Greenland safer? Just the US defending it or all of NATO? Well, there's an answer to that. When Russia invaded Crimea in 14 and then in 22, the eastern area of Ukraine, the US was obligated by treaty to protect Ukraine, and we didn't. So you want to protect Greenland? You want NATO doing it, not just whoever is in the White House.
So let's talk, though, about what's happened in the last couple of days with Trump. First of all, yesterday there was this long, rambling, incoherent review of his first year in office, and then there were Q&A from the press, and they really didn't ask any penetrating questions, mostly softball. Right. Which is the way it is. It's quite distressing. But then today, he has this completely incoherent, slurred and embarrassing speech at Davos before a deadly silent audience. And he's going on about windmills and about how he won in 2020 and all of this stuff. And he also trashed the Europeans and saying how terrible Europe is without offering any evidence. And then also a few days ago, he published a text that he'd sent to the Prime Minister of Norway complaining about why he didn't get a Nobel Peace Prize. And because he didn't get a Nobel Peace Prize, there won't be peace in Greenland, and we're going to go to war. And, of course, the Prime Minister of Norway has nothing to do with the Nobel Prizes. But right. It was completely, again, ungrammatical, crazy. So the question is, why did the same press that piled on about Biden's mental acuity, why are they being so silent, by and large, about Trump's obvious madness?
The answer to that is actually quite simple. In the Biden White House, if you're a White House correspondent and you ask questions they don't want, the worst thing that's going to happen is they're going to not answer the question or give some diverting answer and go on their way. But to the Trump White House, not only are you going to be in trouble, but if you work for a news organization that has government licenses, for example, CBS, ABC, and NBC, which use the public airwaves, your company is going to be in trouble. This is a very smart intimidation tactic. on that part. And then Trump doesn't call on reporters generally who might ask tough questions. A lot of the best questions in recent years have been asked by British reporters, uh, probably in part because there's no lever that Trump has over them. And you're very right, Ian, about how incoherent he's become. A few weeks ago, I was on another show, a TV show, and I urged the audience to look at some video, which they put up, of Donald Trump walking with Putin, walking with the away from the Japanese prime minister, and showing how he was throwing one leg in front of the other and then walking off at an angle. And if you looked at his face, he seemed to be lost. And lo and behold, the other guest is a physician whose specialty is various kinds of dementia. And he explains how this throwing the one leg in front of the other is a classic sign of a particular kind of dementia, not Alzheimer's. It's a prefrontal lobe form of dementia, and then goes on to point out all the other things I had brought up, the same things you had: slurred speech, ideation, nonsensical connections, and referring back to some past things that seem totally unrelated were similarly classic signs. I think Donald has had some, and people listening should know I've known Donald for 37 years. I've spent hundreds of hours with Donald. That something's happened in his brain, and particularly in the last few days. Now, when he spoke leaving the US and he was similarly out of it, I cautioned on a show I was on yesterday, maybe he just didn't get a good night's sleep. But now that it's happened again, and he's had the opportunity to go to sleep on Air Force One, where he has a bedroom, I think this is much stronger evidence. And of course, we'll know that if over the next week or two, he continues this continued degradation of his public comments and his inability to focus. And by the way, what a crazy notion. I didn't get the Nobel Peace Prize from a private group of citizens in Norway, but I want a piece of land owned by the Kingdom of Denmark, a separate country, and now we're going to go to war because of that. I mean, this is, imagine if Joe Biden had said that, how the press corps would have been.
Well, the other thing is, as we discussed earlier, David, the real motive about going after Greenland seems to be to Trump's determination to destroy NATO. Right. At the behest of his best buddy, Putin. And I've been trying to figure out what's going on between Putin and Trump and what hold Putin has over Trump for, going back to 2015. And now our governor here, Newsom, who was in Davos, told the Europeans to get a backbone and to stand up to Trump. And he went on to say that Trump is a Russian mole. And the sooner that the Europeans realize who they're dealing with, the better it'll be. So that is finally somebody with some, stature in terms of being a governor in our politics, and possibly they can, going to run against him, and if he's still around. It seems to me that, it's sort of music to my ears, because it's been very frustrating to get any focus on journalists looking into Trump's ties to Russia and to Putin. And of course, they managed, Trump and company and Bill Barr, and they managed to marginalize the Mueller report, and nobody looked at the Senate Intelligence Committee report, etc. So he's dodged this bullet for the longest time. So do you think it's about time, maybe, that there'll be some focus on what is his relationship to Putin?
Well, there have been some very thoughtful pieces in the New York Times and elsewhere about his relationship with Putin. I don't think there's been anywhere near the necessary coverage. I've been on record for a long time, probably now 15 years, saying that from the point of view of the Kremlin, Donald is absolutely an asset. I mean, the old Soviet was recruiting Donald in 1987. There are Russian ties that go back to at least 1983. And it's not unusual for governments to use their intelligence apparatus to try and win over an interest in, and in some cases compromise, people they think are powerful and prominent in another country. And while Trump in 1983 was just a media curiosity, the same in 87. The fact is, the Russians hit the jackpot with Donald Trump. And we know from the statements put out to reporters without quoting people directly by name, but national security reporters in a number of countries around the world have been told by their sources who are speaking with authority, they just can't be named, that Donald Trump has given away sources and methods to the Russians. Those are the most closely guarded secrets. Who told us that, and how did we find that out? And that's not because he's a Russian mole. That's because Donald has no sense of discretion about things like that. And we know he's done this in other settings. He bragged to a group of women who were in the office one day that, oh, I've got all these papers, and you can hear them rustling. They're national security papers. We know that he told an Australian billionaire businessman about how close American submarines can get to Russian submarines before the Russians can detect us. I mean, talk about a national security secret that you and I have, as taxpayers, spent enormous amounts of money developing, the stealth technology of submarines. And so I'm glad Newsom has spoken up about this. It needs to be very clearly discussed that Donald is carrying Putin's water, and it's contrary to the interests of the U.S. And by the way, that's yet another argument for why the U.S. alone shouldn't be in control of Greenland, which, as the Arctic melts, will be an increasingly significant place. It has a lot of mineral wealth. Trump offered to buy it for, $6 billion, and it's believed that mineral wealth that's recoverable is worth at least $700 billion. So he wanted to pay less than a penny on the dollar. That's Donald. But hopefully other politicians will find some spine. And you don't have to be accusatory the way Gavin Newsom is. You can just say, why is Donald Trump saying X, which happens to be what Putin is saying? Except for some passing news reports, the new Trump 28-point peace plan looks remarkably similar to one circulated by the Kremlin. That's about all you hear. And this area needs to get a lot more coverage, but it isn't going to happen until Democrats or principled Republicans, and that would be even better than Democrats doing it, push the issue, because politics reporters cover the horse race, they cover the back and forth between the politicians. And so long as even the Democrats won't stand up as much as they should to Trump, there's no story for those kinds of reporters.
In the real world, David, don't you think that the leader of the country, if it's shown that he is a traitor, that is automatically disqualifying him in the worst possible way?
Oh, it should. And I think the Europeans have come to recognize. I mean, the Europeans have made it clear that they don't trust Donald Trump. They don't trust him to keep confidences. Macron in particular is put out things suggesting that he does not trust Donald at all. Just to be clear on a little matter, you cannot commit treason right now. That crime does not exist in the United States because we are not in a state of war. The Constitution makes treason a crime when there's a war. The last time Congress declared war was December 9th, 1941, and that status ended in December of 1945 when the last belligerent surrendered. But that doesn't mean Donald's not a traitor in the cultural sense of it is. He is a traitor. He is an enemy of the United States. And yet, tens of millions of people fervently believe he's the only person who should be our leader. And we need to recognize that about our own country, that people think that this credibly accused child rapist, judicially determined rapist of an adult woman, civil, not criminal, but nonetheless, convicted felon with a lifelong history of cheating workers, investors, even gamblers at one of his casinos, as I broke that story many years ago, should be president of the United States. I mean, this is something very serious about the poor quality of our education system, our failure to engage people as citizens and to feel they have a sense of power, and the ability of human beings who feel powerless to bow down to someone who they believe will save them. And what does Donald say? I alone can save you.
My God. Well, I thank you for joining us. I really appreciate it, David K. Johnston.
Anytime, Ian. Take care.
You too. And again, I've been speaking with David K. Johnston, who is the co-founder of DCReport.org, a professor at the Rochester Institute of Technology, and a Pulitzer Prize-winning investigative reporter and 13-year veteran of the New York Times. He is the best-selling author of The Making of Donald Trump, and his latest book is The Big Cheat: How Donald Trump Fleeced America and Enriched Himself and His Family. We're going to take a brief station break and back, examining the shocking fact that this country's closest friend and neighbor is now making precautionary military plans to defend itself against a U.S. invasion ordered by a dangerous American leader who has many times claimed Canada as his 51st state.
Come on now, who do you think you are? Bless your soul. You really think you're in control? Well, I think you're crazy. I think you're crazy. I think you're crazy. Just like me.
Welcome back. I'm Ian Masters, and this is Background Briefing, available 24/7 at backgroundbriefing.org. And joining us now is Christian Leuprecht, who's a distinguished professor in the Department of Political Science and Economics at the Royal Military College of Canada and director of the Institute for Intergovernmental Relations at the School of Public Policy at Queen's University. He's editor-in-chief of the Canadian Military Journal, and his books include Security, Cooperation, Governance, the Canadian-United States Open Border Paradox, and most recently, Military Operations in Response to Domestic Operations and Global Pandemics, Implications for Civil-Military Relations. Welcome to Background Briefing, Christian Leuprecht.
Ian, thanks for having me.
Well, thanks for joining us. And yesterday at Davos, your Prime Minister, Mark Carney, made a very powerful speech that got a rare standing ovation, in which he talked about a rupture in the global order and, quote, said, "Every day we're reminded that we live in an era of great power rivalry, that the rules-based order is fading, that the strong can do what they can and the weak must suffer what they must." And then he went on to warn, "The middle powers must act together, because if we are not at the table, we are on the menu." Now, you contrast that with the speech today by Donald Trump, which was met with a deathly silence as he rambled on about windmills and his grievances about the 2020 elections. So there couldn't be a greater contrast. But what's alarming me, and I think many in this country, is the news that the Canadian military are making precautionary military plans to defend Canada against a U.S. invasion ordered by this dangerous American leader who's many times claimed Canada as his 51st state. So what planet am I on, Christian?
Look, the Canadian forces are only responding to the environment that we live in. Armed forces everywhere have strategic planning staff, and those strategic planning staff are tasked with planning for all possible eventualities for the mandates that they might be given, so that when the government comes and asks them and wants to task them, that they are ready to provide those options. And so this is one of the matters, among many other things, that the Canadian Armed Forces are now planning for, I guess, in the environment that we live in. And that's simply what good government institutions need to be doing in response to changing requirements.
Right, but it's just extraordinary to think that the closest and longest friend to this country, the United States, is Canada. And you don't normally have to defend yourself against your best friends.
Well, Ian, look, I mean, we just celebrated the 250th anniversary on December 31st of George Washington's troops during the Revolutionary Wars marching through Saint-Jean-sur-Richelieu on Quebec City and being beaten back at Quebec City at the British garrison. Of course, we also had the War of 1812. So we've had at least two instances of the United States unilaterally asserting its interests north of the border with military prowess. We have since agreed that this is not the best way to manage our relationships. To the contrary, in 1938 and 1940, which is often referred to as the Ogdensburg Declaration, the Kingston Dispensation, the then president and prime minister agreed that they would work together to keep the threats of the world far away from this continent. And that common strategy has made North America arguably the most stable, the most prosperous, and the most desirable continent that history has ever known. So yes, there's clear value and return on investment that we've seen over the last 75 plus years from the collaboration across the border. But the geopolitical environment for the United States is shifting, as we all know. And in an environment of heightened conflict, and you might say an environment of war, if you look at the conduct of Russia towards Ukraine, and you look at Russian and Chinese doctrine towards the United States and towards allies, we know that from Arthur Schlesinger's book, 1973, The Imperial Presidency, we've seen significant expansion from Washington through Nixon of presidential executive powers. And those expansions have come at the detriment of Congress and at the detriment of checks and balances. And given the heightened time of conflict we live in, we're seeing the current president undoing those checks that Congress had put in place after Watergate in this time of heightened competition. And so I think the Canadian Prime Minister is recognizing what a number of us had cautioned about for the last decade, that both as a result of domestic changes in domestic political opinion in the United States and external changes to the security environment, U.S. behavior was going to shift. And I think we are now starting to see that shift. The challenge is, of course, that unlike the geeks like myself who have seen this coming in terms of political sociology, most of our allies did not take the precautions that they should have. And so now they're going to have to act very quickly to get caught up in this new geopolitical environment.
But surely, Christian, the question is this a change of America and its posture, or is this just the change that this leader has brought about? Because I'm not convinced that anything like a majority of Americans want to claim Canada as their 51st state. And when it comes to Ukraine, a lot of people over here are quite puzzled why Trump is so much in the thrall of Putin. Many analysts think that his claims of wanting to take Greenland is not so much about Greenland, it's about destroying NATO as a gift to Putin. Because if you destroy NATO, you basically hang Ukraine out to dry. And it's very puzzling for us to figure out why Trump continually defers to Putin.
Look, the United States has always acted unilaterally in this hemisphere to assert its interests and its security. And so I think the reactions that we're seeing is a reaction to increased meddling, in particular by China, but also by Russia, by Iran in the hemisphere. I think this is partially at least what Venezuela was about. And I think this is America responding to this new security environment and what superpowers always do, which is that they want to remain top dog. And the reality is, I mean, from an allied perspective, as the United States have always been difficult to work with. Look at NATO, for instance. The United States has always been a veto player, going back to John Foster Dulles and complaints about burden sharing. And NATO has always been a difficult organization, and it definitely is now. At the same time, Canada and the United States, look at the North American Aerospace Defense Command, have a long history of working together and collaborating in a constructive way, and NATO also demonstrates that. And things haven't always been smooth. I mean, if you think back to the early 1970s, where relationships were very difficult between the United States, Japan, Europe. But I think this is a more fundamental shift. This is not just a moment. Because of the challenges that the United States faces in the Indo-Pacific, and because of the reorientation of the world, also in terms of sort of economic terms, political terms, and geostrategic terms. And the The president is, so there is definitely his very particular and peculiar personality that has added on to that, but there are significant structural changes that I think account for the rupture between European allies and Canada on the one hand and the United States on the other, where we have interests diverging, and it is simply more difficult to find common ground. And look, the United States has, for instance, maintained the world's largest military for a reason. So it can act unilaterally in the way it chooses to and when it chooses to, with or without allies. Whereas, of course, allies have let significant capabilities atrophy after the Cold War. And so that means they're not in the position to respond to, in particular, Russian, but also Chinese challenges and collusion by Russia and China in the Arctic that is posing a significant security challenge, not just to the United States, but to allies. Look, I mean, the Greenland, Iceland, UK gap, that's 95% of digital communications between North America and Europe run through that gap in terms of critical infrastructure that runs undersea. If China, Russia, or together were able to challenge dominance, Western dominance over that gap, it would have incalculable consequences for our economies. And we've known that since World War II and submarine warfare in World War II. It's just that the United States is, I think, interpreting some of the Russian actions in a more challenging fashion, perhaps in the Arctic, than allies are. And the United States wants allies to do a lot more. And it's going to take allies a very long time to do that. And I think the current administration feels U.S. interests and U.S. security are threatened if they don't move, and they don't move promptly and quickly. And it's going to take allies quite some time to catch up. And so I think there's both a stick and a carrot sort of approach here. One of the things President Trump has learned in his second term is that menacing allies gets results. Look at the increase in NATO defense spending, and look also how President Trump has now walked back his threats with regards to Greenland and NATO after meeting with Secretary General Mark Rutte, which suggests that there is a deal in the works in the Arctic. So I think President Trump has learned that these menacing words get at least some of the results that the president is looking for. And of course, he always likes to tout the ability to generate results. The problem is, of course, as you rightly point out, you're losing sympathies, will, and support among America's closest allies. And most importantly, you're losing trust, where it's going to be very difficult for allies to, the status quo ante, certainly not an option for allies in terms of their relationship with the United States.
So let's look at the extent to which the alliance between the US and Canada still operates, particularly with NORAD. And then on the other hand, news that's coming out of Canada that they may cancel buying F-35s and instead buy a Swedish fighter. So let's start with NORAD. There's still a lot of cooperation, right?
Well, the Canadian government is treading carefully in terms of, I think, not irritating the Trump administration. So I think certainly not making good on the commitment to the F-35 purchase would be very irritating to the Trump administration. But so would be like a military deployment by Canada to Greenland of the kind that, for instance, Germany and several European allies demonstrated, even though that deployment was, of course, quite small. So this is why I think Canada is buying itself some time here. But it's important to remember that NORAD is atrophying and may possibly disappear in the foreseeable future. We've seen, on the one hand, significant restructure in the U.S. command structure. And just before Christmas, we had the announcement by the Secretary of Defense of merging the territorial command structures into two command structures. One of which would be AmeriCom, that would merge US Southcom and US Northcom, which would then subsume NORAD. So that would mean a significant degrading of the status and importance of NORAD when Canada is only one of a number of countries that would be involved in that command. And the other is technological change, that by virtue of rapid technological change, Canada is simply neither geographically nor technologically as significant a partner in defending the continent as it had been in the past. But that's strategically a significant problem for Canada, because Canada entered into the NORAD agreement in 1957 precisely because Canada is a modest-sized economy and will never have the assets it needs to assert Arctic sovereignty on its own. So if the NORAD agreement atrophies, it means the US would gain greater control over the Arctic. And so the solution to that is more NATO in the Arctic, turning that arc of crisis that we currently have in the Arctic into an arc of stability. And Arctic defense is currently divided into two areas of operations. One is the European Arctic that falls under NATO and the Supreme Allied Commander of Europe. And the other is the North American Arctic that falls under NORAD and US NORTHCOM. So if NORAD atrophies, then the logical solution for Canada is extend NATO command into the Canadian Arctic. But if NATO is going to extend into the Canadian Arctic, that'll mean significant investments by Arctic allies, in particular the Nordic 8 plus Canada, in Arctic capabilities. And those capabilities they don't currently have, and it'll likely take them a decade or more to build those capabilities. And aside what's happening in the Arctic, of course, Canada has never joined ballistic missile defense. And it looks like the Trump administration wants Canada and countries such as Greenland most likely to join in the Golden Dome. That's politically highly controversial in those countries. And it could also get very, very expensive for those countries. So I think this is...
it may not work, right?
Well, the technological conversation, that's a whole separate conversation. But
right.
I think the Trump administration is committed to, we're going to build this thing come hell or high water. And we're going to have allies on board, and we're going to have allies foot part of that bill. And it looks like this is sort of the deal that's coming together over Greenland. And I think this is sort of part of what the posturing by the Trump administration over Greenland is about. So Trump can walk away and say, look, I worked out a new deal on North American security. Whether that deal is fit for purpose or not, we'll have to wait and see.
Well, Christian Leuprecht, I thank you very much for joining us here today. I appreciate it.
It's been my pleasure, Ian. Thank you.
And again, I've been speaking with Christian Leuprecht, who's a distinguished professor in the Department of Political Science and Economics at the Royal Military College of Canada and director of the Institute of Intergovernmental Relations at the School of Public Policy at Queen's University. He's editor-in-chief of the Canadian Military Journal, and his books include Security, Cooperation, Governance, the Canadian-United States Open Border Paradox, and most recently, Military Operations in Response to Domestic Operations and Global Pandemics, Implications for Civil-Military Relations. We're going to take a brief station break and back looking into whether the counterculture can rise again, as artists have always led resistance in America until Trump and the technocracy took over.
Acadian driftwood, gypsy tailwind, they call my home the land of snow. Canadian cold front rolling in, what a way to ride, oh what a way to go.
Welcome back. I'm Ian Masters, and this is Background Briefing, available 24/7 at backgroundbriefing.org. And joining us now is Jonathan Taplin, an author and director emeritus of the USC Annenberg Innovation Lab, who has produced music and film for Bob Dylan and the band, George Harrison, Martin Scorsese, Wim Wenders, and Gus Van Sant, among others. He's the founder of The Entertainer, the first streaming video-on-demand platform, and currently sits on the boards of the Authors Guild, Americana Music Association, and has produced 12 films, including Mean Streets, The Last Waltz, Under Fire, and To Die For. He's the author of Move Fast and Break Things, How Facebook, Google, and Amazon Have Cornered Culture and Undermined Democracy. And his latest book is The End of Reality, How 4 Billionaires Are Selling a Fantasy Future of the Metaverse, Mars, and Crypto. And he has an article at Rolling Stone. Can the counterculture rise again? Artists have always led resistance in America until Trump and the technocracy took over. Welcome to Background Briefing, Jonathan Taplin.
Good to be here.
Well, thanks for joining us. And you begin your article at Rolling Stone, Can the Counterculture Rise Again?, by quoting from W.H. Auden's poem, September the 1st, 1939, on the eve of World War II. And just to quote a little, I sit in one of the dives on 52nd Street, uncertain and afraid, as the clever hopes expire of a low, dishonest decade. And you point out that it has been a low, dishonest decade since Donald Trump descended his golden escalator and transformed our country. So in terms of the counterculture, has Trump transformed the country where the counterculture in the 60s was largely on the left? Now, are you making the case that Trump has turned the counterculture to the right in America?
Well, one of my friends, Greil Marcus, who's a famous critic, made that assertion to me that, maybe I was thinking about the wrong thing of a counterculture being associated with the 60s drugs, sex, rock and roll, whatever, and that maybe the counterculture right today was white nationalism. And that kind of took me aback. Greil's point was that maybe the left had won the culture wars, and it was so that the mainstream culture was a left culture that celebrated gay marriage and, all that sort of thing. And that the counterculture was Tucker Carlson, Curtis Yarvin, those kind of far right-wing things. But I pushed back on him and I said, basically, I think that's not true, because what I really want is a culture. And there's no culture in that right-wing culture. I mean, the best they could do was Kid Rock, I mean, for music.
Right.
Nobody's going to remember Kid Rock in 50
Right.
years.
And, and nobody's going to go to the Trump Kennedy Center.
No, nobody wants to be associated with him. So there is no real culture. And Rachel Kushner, who is another friend, wrote the same thing. He said that there's no dance, there's no poetry, there's nothing. There's just a bunch of wannabe podcasters. So I don't think there is a counterculture at all right now, which is the sad thing. I mean, there's nobody's, with a few exceptions of maybe Bruce Springsteen and a few older boomers like George Clooney, are standing up to Trump. But of the younger artists, the Generation Z kids, I don't see it, quite frankly.
Well, just to touch on Auden's poem, September the 1st of 1939, which you've tied into Donald Trump in terms of a low, dishonest decade. Further down in the poem, Auden says, "A psychopathic God, I and the public know what all school children learn. Those to whom evil is done do evil in return." And boy, that's Trump, if ever was somebody.
Totally. Eye for the eye. I mean, what is obviously going on in Davos today, is insane. I mean, this Greenland obsession he has is not a rational person at all thinking about this, and it's kind of disturbing. But where are the artists? Is what I keep asking. Where are the artists that are making the kind of brave moves that the history of America has been, where there was, Thoreau willing to go to jail to protest the war in Mexico, or, Mark Twain being the head of the Anti-Imperialism League during McKinley's stance, or even Bob Dylan being willing to go down to Greenwood, Mississippi in 1973, 3 weeks after Medgar Evers had been assassinated, and lead a voting rights rally. I mean, that took courage. And I don't see much courage right now. In fact, I make the point near the end of the article that the current artists have all sold out. They're all bought and sold, where they make most of their money from advertising. I mean, look at Snoop Dogg, who was, one of the founders of hip hop, was involved in The Chronic, which to me is the greatest hip hop album ever. And now all he is a shill for corporations.
Right. Well, it is pretty sad. And you mentioned Davos, of course, where Trump was absolutely embarrassing. But the good news, and I know interviewed you before about your call for a California republic. At Davos, Governor Newsom said, in fact, he told the Europeans to, quote, get off your knees and grow a spine. And then he went on to say, quote, Trump is a Russian mole, and the Europeans had better learn fast who they are dealing with. So that's pretty extraordinary, isn't it?
Yeah, well, I mean, you think about what did Putin say in 2015? That his great desire was to disrupt NATO, that NATO was the greatest problem for Russia. And, you and other people during the 2016 election said that, Putin was supporting Trump for a real reason. He had a quid pro quo. And nobody really believed it, and everyone poo-pooed it and all that. And here we are, 10 years later, and Trump is delivering the end of NATO to Putin, and Putin is thrilled.
So let's talk about soft power, which after all it was soft power, not nuclear missiles and military power that ended the Cold War. You write in your article at Rolling Stone, Johnston Taplin, that in June of 1987, at a concert in Berlin, David Bowie chose his song Heroes as his closing number. And the song tells the story of two lovers who met at the Berlin Wall and tried desperately to find a way to get together. So, interesting enough, since I studied Putin, he was, at that time in June of 87, he was called up from Dresden because of this concert, and that the VOPO, the Volkspolizei, the German police could not handle the flood of young East Germans flooding towards the wall to listen to the David Bowie concert that was just on the other side of the wall. And Putin was there with the Stasi and the KGB and trying to stop this flood of young East Germans. And then the promoters of the concert turned the speakers towards the east, and then suddenly this flood of humanity turned into a tsunami. And then Putin got furious because even his own guys, along with the Stasi, were going on with the kids to listen to the music. And he became convinced that this was a CIA provocation. And then exactly 1 week later, Ronald Reagan, at the very same spot, made his famous speech, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall, and at which point Putin became absolutely convinced that the whole thing was a KGB, was a CIA plot. So you have you've got this tool of soft power. Trump has done everything to destroy it. The first thing that happened was Musk destroyed USAID, which was America's most powerful soft power tool. Is there any way to bring it back? Who's talking about that? And particularly in terms of the counterculture, except for of all people, Bill Gates, right?
Yeah. Obviously, soft power has been the secret sauce for America. Why did the State Department send Louis Armstrong to Africa in the late 1950s when all the Russian propaganda was showing pictures of young Black girls being escorted into schools by policemen, by, National Guard troops and everything. And Russia had the basic statement that that America was a racist country. And so we countered it by sending our greatest jazz musician to to Africa. And we also sent him to Russia too later in 59. But the point was that America's history of hard power since World War II has been a sad litany. I mean, when you think about whether it was Korea or Guatemala or, Afghanistan or Iraq or all these incredible, horrible military engagements we got into that we lost. And the only one we won was the Cold War when the Berlin Wall fell down, and not a single shot was fired. And that was simply because the people on the other side of the wall desperately wanted freedom. I'll never forget, I was making a movie with Wim Wenders in early 1989, almost 9 months before the wall came down. And we used to go over to Babelsberg Studios in the East because it was the one big soundstage in Berlin. And when the work would finish, all the workers, the film workers, would come into the cafeteria and drink beer. And up on the screens were 3 large screens showing MTV because they had a satellite dish. And these, literally, a bartender told us he had to throw them out at 10 o'clock because, you know, this was a place where they could go and celebrate the music and the freedom of the West. And it was our greatest tool. And Trump has destroyed it completely. And now when you see Carney or, you know, the Prime Minister of Canada going to China to make, you know, peace with the Chinese and import Chinese electric vehicles into Canada, you realize that Trump has really screwed the pooch. He has eliminated all the cultural power of America, the sense of what the American movies and American TV and everything gave people. And, you know, because I was a film producer in the 60s and 70s and 80s, I traveled all over the world. And it was American music that was on the radio in Nigeria, and it was American movies that were in the theaters in Mexico and stuff like that. So I think that, you know, we could bring it back. Of course we could, but we have to get rid of Trump. I mean, and we have to get rid of Trumpism, and that's a bigger task. I mean, I think it may be easy to get rid of Trump, and maybe as soon as, you know, the midterm elections, we can at least put some leash on him. But whether we get rid of Trumpism is another question.
Right, but in terms of the counterculture rising in this country, I would say that movie, One Battle After Another, is the beginning, isn't it? I mean, that's a pretty powerful movie, and boy, does it echo what's happening with ICE.
Exactly. Look, it's not like it's dead. It's just very quiet. And what disturbs me the most is that somehow the boomers, just like in that movie, are going to have to give the Zoomers a kind of courage transplant to stand up. And of course, the good thing about that movie is the younger people, you know, Leonardo's daughter, who leads the charge at the end against the white nationalists. And I'm just waiting to see that. I mean, I do see it on the streets of Minneapolis. You know, I do see it from the young people who are activists who are trying to, you know, alert their neighbors to what ICE is doing. But I do not see it from the artistic community. And partially that is because, as I said before, I think a lot of people have sold out. I mean, if I had asked Bob Dylan in 1969 to do a commercial, he would have laughed me out of the room. But now, once you are in the business with American advertisers, they are not interested in you being an activist. They're not interested in you expressing your political opinions. And if more than half your income is coming from being an advertising shill, you're going to be kind of quiet.
But the other aspect of it, which you bring up in your article, Jonathan Taplin, is the extent to which artists have been impoverished by the tech billionaires, Musk, Zuckerberg, Thiel, Andreessen, Bezos, Altman, etc., whose platforms are basically giving all of the stuff away for free that artists used to get paid for. And who gets rich? These guys in Silicon Valley get rich, but the artists don't. I mean, one of the guys that you worked with on the band, he pretty much died a pauper, didn't he?
Yeah. I mean, the Levon Helm, the drummer. I mean, you think about what happened for a musical artist, even one who stopped making great music in the late 70s. You know, in the 1980s or late 80s, the CD was introduced, and so if you're a member of the band, everybody who loved your music replaced their LPs with CDs. And so there was a huge influx of money. And Levon Helm was making $100,000 a year in record royalties as late as 1999. And then, of course, you know, Napster comes in 2000, and that just stops. Because why should you buy a new CD of the band's music when you can find it all for free? And still today, it's all on YouTube for free, you know, and we've never been able to get over that. And of course, so that redirecting of all that money from the pockets of the artists to the pockets of the billionaires is one of the great scandals of the current age.
So, just in closing then, since you're trying to arouse a new counterculture to rise again, let's end on a note of rallying the nascent counterculture. I mentioned the good news of that incredible movie that's probably going to win all the awards this year,
Right.
One Battle After Another. So how's this going to happen? I love the idea of the boomers and the zoomers getting together, because you can see that in Mandani and other movements on the left. Even David Plouffe has written an article suggesting that the young people should take over the Democratic Party.
Right. Well, look, this is necessary. I am heartened by a movement called the Americana Music Movement, and I've been involved with the Americana Music Foundation for quite a while. And what it is kind of the new folk music. And you know, when I was very young, 13, 14, and I was going to school in Massachusetts, I would go down to a little club in Cambridge, Massachusetts called Club 47. And there I saw Joan Baez, Bob Dylan, Eric von Schmidt, the Jim Kweskin Jug Band, Flatt and Scruggs. I saw all this handmade acoustic music being played in a little coffee house. And it was the beginning of something extraordinary. I mean, Bob Dylan wrote these songs like Blowing in the Wind, and the times there are changing. And he may not have been the most popular person in the world. I mean, obviously the Beatles were far more popular, but he made a huge difference. And that was what is necessary. So it could be that Billy Strings and, you know, the people that are really started to make this handmade music that is anything but computer generated. And obviously the other thing is that we have to stop all this AI slop music that people are just foisting upon the public. And you know, if we do that, maybe the artists can begin making a little bit of living, and they don't have to go to advertisers to make money.
Right. Well, I can't wait for somebody to turn Bob Dylan's Mr. Tambourine Man into Mr. Tangerine Man in terms of Donald Trump. So I thank you for joining us, Jonathan Taplin.
My pleasure, Ian.
And again, I've been speaking with Jonathan Taplin, an author and Director Emeritus of the USC Annenberg Innovation Lab, who has produced music and film for Bob Dylan and the band, George Harrison, Martin Scorsese, Wim Wenders, Gus Van Sant, and many others. He's the founder of The Entertainer, the first streaming video-on-demand platform, and currently sits on the boards of the Authors Guild, the Americana Music Association, and has produced 12 films, including Mean Streets, The Last Waltz, Under Fire, and To Die For, and is the author of Move Fast and Break Things, How Facebook, Google, and Amazon Have Cornered Culture and Undermined Democracy, and his latest book is The End of Reality, How 4 Billionaires Are Selling Fantasy Futures of the Metaverse, Mars, and Crypto. And he has an article at Rolling Stone, Can the Counterculture Rise Again? Artists have always led resistance in America until Trump and the technocracy took over. And this has been Background Briefing. I'm Ian Masters, and I'd like to thank producers Graham Fitzgibbon, Asher Price, and Sasha Linden-Cohen. If you missed any of today's program and would like to explore our vast archives, you can find us at backgroundbriefing.org, where we include extended interviews, searchable by topic, and have made it easier for you to sign up for daily email updates and provide links to resources, articles, and books discussed on the program. Also, you can find links there to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, and we highly encourage your ratings and reviews on these platforms. Find us on Twitter, Blue Sky, and Facebook at Ian Masters Media, and our new social media manager, Luke Susswood, is also posting highlights from the show on YouTube, TikTok, and Instagram at Ian Masters Media. So please do help us reach more listeners by sharing this program with friends, family, and colleagues. And to help sustain this program into the future and ensure it remains free to all, please take a moment to support us by going to backgroundbriefing.org/donate and/or at publictruthmedia.org, where your tax-deductible donations, large and small, keep us broadcasting. And I'll be back tomorrow with another Background Briefing at backgroundbriefing.org. Bye for now.
By 9:30.